Hello, welcome to this new episode of Hessian Scrum. Joining me today is an absolute legend from the underground, Chuck Keller of Aries Kingdom and Order from Chaos. Hello, Chuck.
Hello.
So let's start with your latest release, By the Light of Their Destruction with Aries Kingdom in 2019.
Right.
So you've been, playing this kind of music for so long, right? How do you have the passion, to put up another ferocious slab of death metal in 2019?
It's a good question. It's just something that I've always done. It's a part of who I am. I don't seem able to stop. I mean, it's one of those activities that you can't control it. From my perspective, I'm always thinking about the next project and what I'm going to do conceptually and musically and lyrically. And I'm always on the lookout for inspirations or for artwork or for phrases or titles or lyric lines that can serve as a springboard to fill in gaps or to just make a point. So it's never ending. It's kind of a torment. I mean, I tell people sometimes that I wish I could stop. And I, like everyone else, I do get tired after a while, and I do need a bit of a break. But even during those breaks, I find myself constantly scanning for some kind of inspiration or the next song, or it's never ending. It's almost a torment.
On this release, we see like a lot of the stuff you've done with Aries Kingdom, but I think you've kind of streamlined from a writing perspective, a lot more, because on the on a Return to Dust, you have like the heavy metal parts, then the death metal parts, and the thrash metal parts. But here, everything seems to be very, very kind of like it all flows very naturally, and there isn't like a sudden shift in styles, if you know what I mean.
Right. We hear that a lot, and I think honestly it is a bit purposeful. I approached this album as a break from the first 3 AK albums that in my mind were inclining towards a culmination. And it was after Unburial Dead that I'm going, well, what else am I going to write about? I mean, really, I was struggling, and so I finished writing in probably 2014. And so I'm like, what am I going to do next? And I had this great moment when I realized, hey, there's a lot of old Vulpecula stuff that I just sort of left on the table when Chris and I ended that band in 99. And I was feeling like I'd really like to finish it, is one way of putting it, but not like there's going to be an end to this. It's just I wanted to continue, pick up and keep going, because in a very real sense, Aries Kingdom was a continuation of Vulpecula, and Ash and Glory on the second album, Incendiary, was, I call it the song that killed Vulpecula, because Vulpecula was supposed to be a very dark, brooding, cult-like thing, and I felt after a time that it was straying towards something a little too sophisticated. And when I came up with the embryonic version of Ash and Glory in the late 90s, I'm like, this isn't going to fit Vulpecula. And Mike and I had started Aries Kingdom in late 96, so it was just this sort of seamless connection between the bands. And in fact, at the very end of Vulpecula, we had invited Mike to become our drummer anyway. And then Chris, who was this phenomenal keyboard player and could just do things that blew our minds, Chris was going to focus on that in that studio project band. And so I would love to have brought Chris into the fold for Aries Kingdom, but his interest went another direction, and it was totally cool, and everything just kind of flowed from one to the other without any drama that time. So Aries Kingdom picked up from, you can say it picked up from where OFC left off, because we were talking at the end of OFC, we'll take a little time off, we'll come back together with the three of us, and we'll continue with something new. So at least in the minds of Mike and I, Aries Kingdom is a continuation of OFC, but it's also a continuation of Vulpecula. So it's a pretty organic flow. And it was thinking back across the history of Aries Kingdom that in 2015, I'm like, well, why don't I pick up that old Vulpecula stuff and go? And it's not like there was a huge amount of music. It was more concepts, the atmosphere, the approach that I was wanting to pick up and move forward with. So when you're absolutely right when you're saying, there are old heavy metal influences present in the first AK album, and arguably not really arguably in Incendiary as well. Actually in all three, let's be honest. So when we started working on the material I had written for By the Light, it was a very different mindset. We were devolving in a lot of ways. We were, most bands as they age, they get more sophisticated, and their albums are longer and they're more noodly and a little wanky. And that's not really what we ever wanted to do. Obviously we've proven we can do that, but that's neat. But we got into doing this, 35, 40 years ago. And when you're a young musician, you usually can't play that well. And so your songs are necessarily primitive and deeply from the heart. You're not even really thinking about the technical things that you can bring into your music. You're just really expressing yourself. And I think we tapped into that with By the Light, because when I wrote that album, I approached it from that perspective. I'm not trying to be noodly. I'm not trying to be a guitar hero. I'm not trying to do anything other than create something really dark and heavy. And I feel like we succeeded. And that's a springboard, that's proven to be a springboard into the material that we have ready. And we're starting to record the new album now, as a matter of fact. So there'll be a new record before this whole pandemic thing is over. So when we finally do hit the road, hopefully next year, we'll be touring for 2 records.
Cortana, and I'm here to help.
Sorry, I'm rebooting a PC over here. So sorry.
No worries, I understand.
Ready for all you plan to do.
So
You can use your voice or the keyboard along the way. And if you'd like me to stay quiet, you can just mute your PC. If you need an assistive screen reader, press the Windows Control and Enter keys.
Quiet. There we go. Okay.
Now, you see, one thing I've noticed about your music, and I'm really happy because you said that you're often inspired by imagery, phrases, lyrics. There's a huge interplay between, what you play musically and the kind of art, because, the lyrics are always very developed for all of Aries Kingdom songs. So also, how do you manage, from a guitar player perspective? Okay, you have an influence. How do you put it in the realm of guitar playing? You don't have words.
Right. I'm a degreed historian. My job is I work as an appraiser for historical artifacts and rare antiquarian books, things like that, and fine art as well. So when I write, everything gets run through that prism of what I do, who I am, because, ultimately the best writers have written about what they know. And to another extent, a lot of writers will explore things that are new to them in songs and lyrics, more or less effectively. But I've just always chosen to write about what I know. And that's why I've never written about, sodomized zombie Jesus and, raping angels and all that bullshit, because I don't know anything about it. I don't care. None of it was really part of of who I am. I just don't care about that kind of thing. And so that's not what I'm going to write about. I was influenced deeply by, Voivod when you look at the things that they were writing about and the way the interplay between the music and lyrics, you know, what you're talking about with what I do, that makes me feel great, because that's how I always perceive Voivod. And I looked at Voivod and I said, that's something special. Nobody's done that before. That's a really interesting marriage between the intellect and the music. And, you know, you can go back to a band like Iron Maiden that really showed everyone how you incorporate literary and historical themes into heavy metal. And it works. You know, I don't really know of any other kind of music where you can marry such disparate topics. And it's really cool. So it's just something I've always wanted to take advantage of and continue to do. Now, how do they impact, inform, inspire, whatever? That's a more abstract concept. I don't know how to describe that. It's just something that when I'm writing music, I know when something is right. And a lot of it, I guess you could say, it comes down to the particular mood of the subject. That will help you, that will influence what you're playing as you're doing the writing and developing it. So it's really the mood that the intellect generates that gets translated through the hands and onto the instrument. So,
you know, also during your lead parts, when your lead playing, you have a very strong narrative aspect to how you play your leads. You know, I always feel like your solos are a sort of a story within a story.
Yeah, exactly right. I'm glad to hear you say that, because that's always been my goal. I subscribe to the notion that a solo should be a song within a song. Now, I did go through periods, obviously, where I love doing noise bursts, and it's almost nonsensical. You know, the early OFC had a lot of elements of that. When I say early OFC, I mean the LPs. When you go back to the demo stuff, it's more like what Aries Kingdom is now, where I was trying to be very musical and say something within the leads, and make those little journeys within a larger journey. So yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to hear that people have recognized that, and because to me, it's just what helps make a really great, memorable song.
Yeah, definitely. You know, A Dream of Armageddon has a great example where you kind of like spamming this 3-note lick quite a lot, and it just somehow feels right, you know, despite being such a simple thing that you're playing very quickly.
Right, and it's knowing how to tastefully do that. I guess a lot, in a very real sense, it's knowing how to do more with less. And God, it's really such a tired and kind of goofy statement, but there's a lot of truth in it too. You know, less is not necessarily more, but sometimes it is. You know, it's like there are no rules except that one. I mean, it's when you get into the musical realm, everything becomes abstract, and a lot of rule books go out the window, right? So yeah, that's really what we're talking about here.
Yeah. You mentioned Vulpecula earlier, which is quite funny because, you know, between Order from Chaos and Aries Kingdom, I can feel the continuity quite a bit more. But then Vulpecula really had those touches of almost black metal ambience.
Yeah, and that was the point. You know, OFC was such an intense thing for all three of us. Everything had to be exactly right, and it was an immersive thing. I mean, it absolutely consumed the three of our lives, and you know, we were young. We were, you know, teens and early 20s when we did all that, and so we weren't really equipped as older people to know how to process a lot of that. So when we got to the end of OFC, especially from my perspective, it was utter exhaustion. I'm like, we've set these constraints on ourselves that we don't deviate from. Everything gets run through this one particular prism before we do it, and I needed a chance to cleanse the palate, so to speak. And so that's what Vulpecula was. It was a way of celebrating the primitive and just going, not really going back to roots, but just doing something so utterly different from what I had been doing that I just needed it. And so that's what I did.
Yeah, because when we hear Order from Chaos, something that's always surprised me is I hear a lot of death metal. There's some grindcore, some thrash, everything except for black metal, which is funny considering how many black metal bands you inspired.
Yeah, it's been like that from time immemorial. I mean, really, we get, OFC gets pigeonholed with the Beharits and the Sarcophagos and the Blasphemies, and that's great. I love it because we occupy a really unique niche in all of that because we're very different from all of them. And I go back to the Voivod example. I think that's really our dynamic. You look at Voivod and the influence they had across musical spectrums, from black metal to progressive metal. I mean, they were across the board highly influential on everyone. And yet, when we think back to Voivod, what are they? Well, we think of them as a thrash metal band. So that's, they get pigeonholed into thrash, even though they had this unbelievably broad palette that they used, that inspired so many people across the board. I mean, maybe the only other band that has inspired that many people and that many different kinds of metal was Venom. Because Venom started all of they started thrash metal, they started death metal, they started black metal. It all starts with Venom. The Venoms and the Voivods. I think that's what OFC has the most in common with in terms of what our impact was. And even though we don't sound like Sarcophago or Beharit or Blasphemy in the least, we're still part of that time period. And also the obscurity of our music, because let's face it, our production was almost always crap. And so that can help create an atmosphere that fans gravitate to, including myself. I mean, I was no connoisseur of great production back in the day. I mean, I loved that War and Pain sounded like War and Pain. I loved that Venom sounded like a garage band. It brought such a unique flavor to each of those bands. They were unmistakable. Nobody else sounded like them. Nobody could sound like them. And so with OFC, that wasn't conscious, but we lucked into it. And the fact that we got pigeonholed with these other bands, that's fine. I mean, it's great, but we don't really have anything in common with them.
I think that's because you guys were so idiosyncratic, and when something is so apart from everything else, people have to lump it together. We like to have categories. As humans.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I worked in a record store in the late 80s, and everything was about categorization. And if you go back and you look at the over here, it was Important Records. They were the big distributor for independent music in the U.S. And if you look at their old catalogs and how they had everything categorized, it was it's no surprise that everybody pays attention to categorization today, because that's the way we were all trained back in the 80s. Now, there were fewer categories back then where you would find all these bands like Celtic Frost and Sodom and Bathory planted in the thrash metal category. And that's still how I think of all those bands. I know everybody has them split out into, this is black metal and this is death metal and this, whatever. For me, it's like, well, it's all thrash metal. But categorization has always been around, and it's really important to some people. Okay.
Because I've noticed that now we have so many metal categories. I kind of hate it when I receive a promo for a band and it's like you have some very specific guidelines. Do you think that kind of neuters creativity?
If a band thinks like that, if they think that they're just a thrash metal band or a black metal band or death metal band, yeah, absolutely, that can mute creativity. But the whole idea behind what metal is, I mean, we're we're the last bastion of true rebellion in the rock and roll Frankenstein monster. Everything else has basically been domesticated or broken and become suitable or semi-respectable. I mean, from the old rock and roll that you can find played in the White House to jazz, whatever, everything is acceptable. Even punk rock has been kind of sanitized to the point where the big people that never went to a punk show when they were younger are showing up in punk rock t-shirts or talking about punk as if they were always hip about it. They're not. Rock and roll is supposed to be dangerous, and it's been broken in so many areas. But metal is it's the black sheep of the music family. It's the one area that has just refused to be tamed. It's the one area of music that the general population feels it's okay to joke about and laugh about stereotypes about heavy metal this, heavy metal that. If you do that to any other kind of music, you're going to be treated like a Philistine. Like, well, music is subjective. How dare you say something negative about that? How dare you say you don't like that because, fuck off. This is the metal is the black sheep, and we're proud of it. And I hope we never lose that edge. I know there are a lot of people in the scene today working to sanitize it, but I don't really think it'll be tamed.
Look, I've heard metal with auto tune, so I don't really know anymore.
Yeah, right, right.
Yeah, it's always bad. Let's go through your. There's one concept I always heard about. Everything that you've been involved with is that everyone says Aries Kingdom or Order from Chaos, even Vulpecula. It's the most metal there is. Like that's how I've seen people, like a million reviewers categorize your music.
Yeah, well, that's actually really cool. I mean, that's the point, isn't it? We're a metal band, and we're not pretending to be anything else. And yeah, I mean, that's great to hear. I mean, I would agree. We are a metal band. We're not everyone's cup of tea. I mean, some people want their music to do certain things, and I get that. But I'm the same way. So, but yeah, no, that's a fantastic descriptor. I hadn't really heard that, but I agree. That's the gist of what I experience when I talk to people about, Aries Kingdom or any of the projects that I've been involved in. It's always been true metal.
I mean, do you think that kind of in a way puts you in a kind of small box, because that there are some subtle outside influences that come up in your music, it's not one note blasting,
Mm-hmm. No, I don't feel limited. And again, it's all about running things through prisms before you do it. And when I'm writing, everything gets translated into my metal prism. I jokingly refer to it as I run everything through a Slaughterlord prism. How would Slaughterlord have done this? Because they're one of my ultimate bands. And it's a lot more complicated than that. But basically everything gets run through my personal prism. And then once I've written the songs and I hand them over to Mike and Alex, and we work out nuances together so they can incorporate their styles, then it becomes Aries Kingdom. And that's what makes it unique. But it all has to start somewhere. And so with my writing process, it's metal. I mean, I could, and sometimes I've done this with people. I'm like, well, something was inspired by Kate Bush or Marillion, and people will listen to it and go, or they'll hear that in the abstract and go, well, what? And then I'll play the original, whatever it was that inspired me, and it'll be this head slapping moment that you hear it 3 states away. It's like, oh, you got to be kidding me. I'm like, but yeah, you run it through a metal prism and it becomes different. And you run it through the AK machine and it becomes AK. So I draw from all over my musical taste, and I'm not going to be one of these pretentious pricks that says, oh, I listen to everything, because I fucking don't. a lot of things that I really just don't care about whatsoever. But the things that I do love, I really love them. And those are the things that I've been doing this, been playing in bands for 35 years. And I'm just, the formula I have now has worked that long. So I'm not going to change it.
Yeah, because the first time I ever heard, you said Slaughterlord. Now, the first time I ever heard of Slaughterlord is when you released the live video last year, the Chaos Mongers Alive, hymn to Aries. And there was one song I didn't recognize from the album, Die by Power.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was on Veneration. That was a song that we wanted to cover even back in the UFC days, and when you listen to the original, it is so obscure and so over the top, and especially when you think about it, we heard it right after it came out in '87, and so it was just like, it was inconceivable. It was like this perfect mix of Sodom and Bathory and Venom and Slayer, and we're like, this is an ultimate band. I mean, this is how you do it. And so for us, it became this oracle, this touchstone, this thing, like everything should try to be that great. And when we approached Die by Power in the late 80s and early 90s, we're like, I don't know how to do this. But fast forward to when we did Veneration around 2010, 2011, that's when we were ready to, and felt confident enough to do the song justice. And it was a high point of our career. We worked really hard. We probably, we've done several covers in our history, and none of them we worked harder on than Die by Power, because that thing it had to be right. It had to pay homage to the original, but it also had to have our stamp on it. And so we're really proud of that song, and we're kind of known for that song. There's a lot of our old fans that if we play live and we don't play Die by Power, we haven't really played. So
yeah, because the original is so abstract. A lot of
right.
Well, I wasn't born during that period, so but all that kind of metal in the late 80s was so abstract. Like even the vocals you don't really know if he's screaming, shouting, or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
The guitars, you don't really get it. It's like the Death, like all those demos he did before, Scream Bloody Gore. I mean, do you think that helped you kind of, because you didn't really hear it properly, you kind of had to imagine the music?
Absolutely. Yeah, and that's exactly it. And it was that kind of mystery and mystique that everybody's drawn to it. It's like, the figurehead of all mystery is Bathory. I mean, it was just one of those mysterious bands it's what drew me to it originally. Then I got to know Ace and became good friends, but that's what drew me to them. Just like any of these other old bands, like, what the hell is going on with that band? That is insane, and that was the draw, because it was mysterious, it seemed dangerous, it was just so out of the ordinary. It's our personality types. We're like, yeah, that's what we wanted. That's what we want to do. That's what we want to be around. That's what makes us feel good. That's our comfort zone. That absolute insanity and mystery. We loved it. And so, yeah, that's certainly a huge draw.
All right. Let's talk about, your guitar playing style. You were one of the first, bands to kind of, you weren't trem picking constantly with your right hand, though you were taking, you're playing some like very chuggy Metallica styled riffs a lot of the times, especially on the, onto an ending fire.
Mm-hmm.
But you weren't doing like Suffocation, but I don't know how to describe it. You had a very particular kind of rhythmic approach to playing guitar.
Yeah, and that's comes from the old school. I mean, I was telling a friend of mine who's not really a metal guy, but knows about what I do, and he's interested in what I do and how I do it, and good Lord, why do you still do it? And I was telling him that I started with heavy metal 40 years ago, whatever, and for the first couple of years, I was just a fan. I mean, I played instruments. I played piano and I played trumpet when I was a kid, but I didn't pick up guitar until '85. And the reason I picked up guitar was not really because of the old bands that I loved, like Maiden and Priest and Dio and Sabbath. It wasn't those bands that made me want to pick up an instrument and play. It was Metallica, Exodus, Slayer, Venom. Those are the bands that I'm like, wow, that's what I want to do. That's why I picked up a guitar. And honestly, I mean, from a soloist perspective, it was when Yngwie Malmsteen hit. Because before I was ever into rock and roll, I was a classical guy. And I could recognize in heavy metal in the early 80s, I'm like, this has kind of a quasi-classical approach. And that's really what kind of drew me to it, as well as the topics and the atmosphere. And then when Yngwie hit, I'm like, oh, so you can do it. You can do actual classical music and heavy metal. That's what sold me. And so in terms of wanting to play guitar, it's him. But in terms of writing music, it was those other early thrash bands. And what's the common denominator? The music, the guitar parts at least, are very rhythmic, syncopated, chunky. They have a lot of balls. You listen to Bonded by Blood, which is still a Touchstone album. I mean, that's really, every good guitarist has Bonded by Blood near the top of their favorite list. And it's highly influential. I mean, to the point to where it's so influential, I think people forget to talk about it. I think they take it for granted. But that's where I came from. And and again, kind of going back to one of your points, in those days, there was very little video to accompany the music that we loved. And so as you're a young musician and you're learning to play guitar and you're developing your style, and you're learning to play things that other guys have played, you had to rely on your ear. Obviously no internet, and certainly even if you had a VHS of someone playing, it was usually so grainy you couldn't tell what they were doing. So you had to translate things yourself. And the first layer of that's what's the quality of your ear. Second layer is how well can you translate from your ear to your hands. So there, you got a lot of variety in there. And even into the late 80s, when we had some other friends that played guitar hanging around with us, and they were playing some of the old, like early death metal stuff. And they had, I remember one guy in particular wanted to play Chapel of Ghouls, and he came in the Morbid Angel song, and he came in and he was playing it, and I'm looking at what he's doing. I'm like, that's not what they did at all. And I showed him, and he's like, oh, but I heard it like that. I'm like, no, you didn't hear it right. So it all comes down to the quality of a person's ear. And I mean, now we're all spoiled, right? If you want to cover a band, you jump online to see if somebody's published tab for it, or you hop on YouTube and there's usually some decent definition video of the band playing it. And so you can make out what's going on and do it a lot easier than you used to be able to. So we're spoiled now, but that's really what made those old days so special, is because everything was shrouded in mystery.
But then, Order from Chaos's vision was really clear. I mean, I know, you've said quite a few times that you don't like the production, but it's still noticeably much clearer than what was going on before.
Yes. And as a matter of fact, I've always had this difficult relationship with Still Earth Machine, because from the moment we finished it, I hated the guitar production. And it's all my fault, because I was working with our producer, the closest. And there were, personal reasons for all that. They're irrelevant now, but I just never liked it until recently. I was listening to it in the car, and I'm like, I guess I've after 30 years, I finally see what everybody else sees in this album. It's because I've always loved the songs. I mean, I spent years in OFC playing those songs, so I was able to kind of mentally get over the horribleness of the guitar production. And I still love all those songs. And so finally in the last year or so, I'm like, okay, I guess I get what everybody sees about it and likes about it. So good enough.
Because that album is quite a bit of an outlier in your career.
And it's only because of the production. If I were to sit down and play those songs for you, especially the way that they were originally written, you'd be like, it sounds like Aries Kingdom. Because it is. I mean, my writing style and how I've approached writing hasn't changed all that much. It's just, recently like I said earlier, I mean, we're going for the more primitive. We're kind of devolving back towards the beginning of what a band was. But that's kind of the era I'm talking about. It's very metal. I mean, that's why one of the reasons we call our own studio Very Metal Sound. I mean, yeah, it's a nod to the young ones and Vivian's Jacket, but the whole thing, it's got to be very metal, or we're not interested.
Yeah, because it's always on Stillbirth, compared to the other two albums. For some reason, I always felt there was a grindcore influence, like the really nascent stuff.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Because at the time, I mean, this is a difficult thing to describe to people that didn't live through that revolution. When you look at how metal evolved, let's just say, not all the way back to Sabbath, but like starting in the 80s with new wave of British heavy metal, it was getting progressively more extreme and vicious. And, you had heavy metal, and then you had new wave of British heavy metal, and you had thrash metal, and, death metal began to percolate around the, in the late 80s. And then death metal, really blew up. For me, the big dividing point is that first wave of earache in 1989. I consider that like the beginning of the new school. Everything to me before then is old school. From 89 on, that first wave of earache and even Peaceville stuff was all new school. And it was such a breath of fresh air at that time, because as youngsters that were big fans of bands like Sodom and Bathory and Destruction and those bands, there was like a 3-album rule. A band would start its career, and the first 3 albums seemed to be fantastic. And then by the 4th album, it was just like, what are you doing? And by 88, 89, early 89, there really weren't that many great thrash metal albums being released. Very, very few. And so when death metal hit, it was just this blast of fresh air. Like, oh my God, somehow the music, the scene, the people got a recharge, and it just became this unearthly beast. You look back on it now, and those lines aren't so clear anymore, but at the time they were. It felt like a revolution. And so yeah, and especially in the early grindcore and that early death metal era, yeah, everybody was influenced by that. I mean, I was a huge Morbid Angel freak for the first couple of records. Love Carcass, love Bolt Thrower, which actually you can go back to Bolt Thrower and go, but there's a lot of mystery in their sound. That band is really, I mean, it's one of the heaviest bands in history. And when you listen to their records, you're like, good God, how does it get any heavier than that? Well, the answer is it doesn't. So all of those things were huge influences on OFC, just because we existed at the time, and we existed in that milieu, however you want to say it. Everybody was influenced by that. And the advantage that OFC had, and our label guy, Yoski, says this, he puts a really fine point on it, and I won't be able to say it as well as he does, but one of the things that he likes about OFC is we're like a lot of his other favorite bands that existed in areas where there was no scene. The band was its own scene. And so they're not disproportionately influenced by the crap going on around them. They had to decide who they were and be comfortable with their own personalities and just be what they were. And it's such a valid point that I love it, because it really did define who we are and how we did what we did. And when you look back now, it makes perfect sense. Yeah, we were alone in Kansas City. There was a metal scene here, but all it did was reflect the national and international trends. And it was terminally 2 or 3 years behind, especially the underground. When guys around here were finally shouting Slayer, we were like Slaughterlord. You know, we were just so many steps ahead of everyone else. And for that reason, that's why OFC never played that many gigs around here. It's because the local promoters were like, that band is just off limits. I don't know what they're doing. I don't know why they're doing it. You know, 10 people will come to see them, so I'm not going to book them. You know, that's just the way it was in those days.
Oh my God. Well, you know, it's quite funny how that turned out, because I think, yeah, OFC is the only band from Kansas I probably know.
Yeah, and we're not even from Kansas, so we're a Missouri band, actually.
I never understood, because everywhere on the internet says Kansas, and then you told me once that you're from Missouri. I still don't understand where that confusion comes from.
You have to get out a map of the U.S. and look at Kansas City and see that there were two Kansas cities. There's one on the Kansas side and there's one on the Missouri side. The one on the Missouri side is bigger, and that's the one we're from. So we do that on purpose to confuse everyone. It's like in Texas, there's a Missouri City, Texas, you know, and there's a Paris, Texas. And it's like, there's a Vichy, Missouri, I mean, because obviously we had a lot of immigrants from all around Europe, and wherever those particular communities settled, it had a strong flavor of where they came from. So, but yeah, I mean, sometimes I wonder if we didn't just name places just to confuse everybody else. It doesn't seem to be any other explanation for it.
Oh my God, yeah. I'm sorry, I just had to look up Vichy in Missouri. It's that for me is way too funny. Yeah.
Well, I know it because my daughter goes to a college close to there, and so I drive through it and I giggle every time. I'm like, oh my gosh. And it was named long before the Second War, so it doesn't carry that connotation, but I drive through it and I still giggle as an historian. I still giggle when I drive through it.
I live in France. That has a really strong connotation.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Yes, it does.
All right. So let's talk a bit about, the kind of forgotten OFC album, An Unending Fire, because that came out after you guys broke up.
Yeah, several years. That was basically our last project. We knew it was over. We all knew it was time to end. More or less, we knew that. It just couldn't have gone on any longer at that point. And we finished it in June of 95, something like that. And I don't think it came out until 98. Pete was able to shepherd it to Osmos. And I mean, when Osmos released it, I think they did it. They didn't do anything for it. They didn't actually care about it. They put it out and they didn't promote it, and it just flopped. And it is unfortunate because it was our final and greatest statement. It is what everything OFC had been inclining towards since the beginning, and we poured everything into it. Now, obviously, since then, the cult has grown, and that album among fans, it gets listed as a favorite among fans. So it has gotten its due in a lot of quarters. And, when NWN did the box set, it got proper treatment. And it was, I wish people would talk about it more. It's, one of my absolute favorite OFC records. But maybe someday they'll talk about it even more. I don't know.
Yeah, because you were saying, By the Light was you devolving, but an Ending in Fire was literally you getting even more technical. It was like, not nudely, but it was just very, very advanced, compared to, to what we from the beginning of OFC and how it progressed.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely right. I mean, that's why I say it's what everything had been inclining towards. It's what OFC had always wanted to be, and every recording that we did in one way or another was a stair step towards an Ending in Fire. And that's why the title was so appropriate. It was like, we finally done it. We finally achieved what we were going to do. And I know that Gene from Angel Corpse has said that he looks at Return to Dust as what OFC would have done had OFC continued. And I think he's absolutely right about that, because it was, I hadn't really thought about it in those terms, but he was right. I mean, that's basically what OFC would have done if we had stayed around. It was not going to happen, but at any rate, it's, when you look at there's a lot of similarities between those two albums, I think, anyway.
Yeah. I can definitely see that. I think if they both had the same production and you didn't tell it, you didn't tell anyone what was which, people would get confused.
Possibly, yeah, absolutely. And it's funny because An Ending in Fire was recorded on an 8-track cassette player in a private studio. It was the same place we had recorded everything since Plateau in 92, 93. But yeah, it was just done so primitively. I mean, it's a miracle we got an album that sounded halfway decent out of that place. Actually, Vulpecula recorded everything there as well. But yeah, anyway.
One thing that really impressed me on Return to Dust, you have these kind of parts where like really fast melodic parts, that can kind of sound like Priest or Maiden riffs, but sped up 10 times. And the only, the first band that came to mind was, the Canadian thrash metal band Annihilator.
Really? Okay.
Yeah, because, it's, I don't know how you say, these like heavy metal riffs, but like sped up so quickly. Let me think of a good example. The ending on Failsafe, for example. So, I wanted to know, were you guys still playing around with a lot of heavy metal stuff? Because, it contrasts a lot of the kind of more typical thrash death stuff that you were doing.
Well, I think that it is thrash, because to me, thrash is the old heavy metal sped up, exactly as you described. Thrash is like it's the hypercharged heavy metal. You look at a band like Living Death from Germany, who, at the time I was like, yeah, it's a good band. And over time, my appreciation for them has grown to this point that it's like, they're almost mythical to me. But when you look at their music, they're like Judas Priest on 45 or 78, And so as a thrash metal band, that's kind of what thrash metal was. It was taking the old classical heavy metal and giving it a real kick in the arse and pushing it faster and faster and faster and faster. And there are a lot of reasons for that, but that's what defined thrash to me. So to me, Failsafe and songs like that are faster, that is thrash metal. I mean, it all has heavy metal roots, right? I mean, yeah. Of course it does. But to me, it's archetypal thrash metal.
All right, so I've got a pretty much a final question at this point. Your use of rhythms, like if we were to remove kind of like the notes and just focus on the rhythms, because metal has become so rhythmical these last couple of years, just one note chugging. But your sense of rhythm was really unique. It reminds you of like Suffocation had their own sense of rhythm, Immolation, a lot of those New York bands, and then there was Order from Chaos. So what was your relationship in regards to how you wrote rhythms on the guitar?
It comes from Bonded by Blood. When you listen to music from the first era of thrash, where those guys were still super musical, there's a lot of syncopation. There's a lot going on the right hand of the guitarist, and that's what made me want to play to begin with. And so naturally, that is what I do. That's my foundation, and so that's why I play like that. And I guess as the writer, I don't pay that much attention to my various periods. That's kind of for you guys to do, because you'll have a better perspective on it than I will. I'm in the middle of it, right? Yeah. So I'll count on you guys to tell me what you're hearing throughout my career. But I've heard Alex say the same thing about the evolution of my sound and the songs that I'm bringing. That there's a lot more syncopation in some of them, and I'm just like, oh really? Okay, I thought I was writing great riffs and that was it, I mean, one to the other, move it on. But yeah, it comes from that first wave.
Yeah, but it's not just syncopation, because every band knows how to palm mute. You just put the right hand on the strings and it goes chugga chugga. But I don't. You just had a really weird sense of rhythm. It just I haven't heard a band quite like it, to be honest.
Well, thank you. I mean, that's great to hear. I'm glad that it's being interpreted like that. To me, I'm doing an homage to the bands that taught me to play or made me want to play. But I love it. I love hearing that.
All right. Well, I think that should wrap us up for now. Any last words?
No, thanks for the great questions. I mean, if you set out to have a different kind of interview, you absolutely succeeded, because I don't get many interviews that are this quality. So I really appreciate it. Thank you very much. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
Absolutely.
And I hope you have a good rest of your day.
Yeah, you too. Thanks.
Thanks. Bye.